The most wanted scientists in post-war aftermath. How the men who ran Japan's secret biological warfare program in occupied Manchuria were never tried at Tokyo because the United States traded immunity for their research files. The story is told through the architecture of the cover-up, the sealed complex at Pingfang, the negotiations during the occupation, divergence between the American silence and the Soviet trial. The tone is calm, precise, and morally exact, like a journalist who has finally been allowed to read the declassified files and explain, without sensationalism, what was paid and what was hidden. The most wanted scientists in post-war Japan were men the Allies would never put on trial, because by the time the prosecutors at Tokyo were deciding whom to hang, America had already bought their silence. The surrender had been signed. The occupation had begun. And while the world watched Japan's generals and admirals answer for the war in a courtroom, a different transaction was taking place in the quiet rooms of the occupation administration. A senior officer of the Imperial Japanese Army, the head of a program that had operated in secret in occupied Manchuria for more than a decade, sat across from American investigators and offered them something. He offered them his files. In exchange, he asked for protection, for himself and for the men who had worked under him. The Americans considered the offer, and then they took it.
To understand the bargain, you first have to understand what was being traded. In the far north of the Japanese Empire, in the puppet state of Manchukuo that the army had carved out of Chinese Manchuria, there was a place called Pingfang. It lay on the flat plain south of the city of Harbin, reachable by a spur of the railway, surrounded by a wall and a perimeter that ordinary travel maps of the region simply left blank. Officially, it was a water purification and epidemic prevention department of the Kwantung Army, the formation that garrisoned Manchuria. That description was true in the way a cover story is true. It described the smallest, most respectable fraction of what the complex actually was. Behind the wall stood a compound of laboratories, administrative buildings, a power plant, an airfield, and housing, an industrial campus built for research the Army did not intend the world to see. It had a designation, a number assigned in the Army's order of battle that meant nothing to anyone outside it. The designation was Unit 731.
Unit 731 was the center of the Japanese Army's biological warfare program. Its purpose was the study, development, and intended military use of disease as a weapon, the cultivation of pathogens, the design of methods to deliver them, and the research that would make such weapons reliable on a battlefield. This episode will not dwell on the human cost of how that research was conducted, and there was a reason for that restraint. The men who built Unit 731 understood that the value of what they had done lay not in its cruelty, but in its data, in the records, the findings, the accumulated knowledge that no other nation possessed because no other nation had been willing to acquire it the way they had. When the war ended, the cruelty was something to be hidden. The data was something to be sold. And the distinction between those two things, between the crime and the archive the crime produced, is the hinge on which this entire story turns.
The man at the center of it was an army officer named Ishii Shiro. He was a physician by training, ambitious, politically skilled, and convinced from early in his career that biological weapons were the future of warfare, and that Japan, lacking the industrial base of its rivals, should invest in them precisely because they were cheap and terrible. He spent the 1930s building his program from a modest research station into the sprawling complex at Pingfang, cultivating patrons inside the Army's high command, and running his unit with the autonomy of a man who answered to almost no one. By the time the war reached its final year, Ishii commanded a scientific organization that the Army had spent enormous resources to build and to conceal. And As the Soviet Union prepared to enter the war against Japan in the summer of 1945, Ishii understood, perhaps better than anyone, that the most dangerous thing he possessed was not a weapon. It was the knowledge of what he had done, and the records that proved it.
The complex at Pingfang was designed, from its foundation, to disappear. The Army had chosen Manchuria for the program in part because it was distant from the home islands and from any outside scrutiny. And it had built the facility on a scale that required the secrecy to be structural rather than incidental. The perimeter was patrolled. The railway spur that served it was controlled. The surrounding area was cleared. Local maps treated the site as empty ground. The personnel who worked inside it were sworn to a silence that extended past their service and, in the Army's intention, past the war itself. For more than a decade, this arrangement held. The program grew. The research advanced. The records accumulated in the filing rooms of the administration buildings. And almost no one beyond a small circle inside the Kwantung Army and the High Command in Tokyo knew the full nature of what Pingfang was. The cover story did the work it was built to do. The blank space on the map stayed blank. On the 8th of August, 1945, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan, and its forces poured across the Manchurian border. For Unit 731, this was the scenario that all the secrecy had been built against. Not an enemy that might learn of the program from a distance, but an army that was advancing directly toward Pingfang and would, within days, be standing inside it. The response was immediate and total. The order went out to destroy the complex. Demolition teams set charges in the main buildings. Files were burned. Equipment was smashed or buried. The most incriminating physical evidence of what the facility had been was systematically eliminated in a matter of days, while the personnel and their families were loaded onto trains and moved south, away from the advancing front, back toward Korea and the home islands. The Army was not merely retreating, it was erasing, trying, in the narrow window before the Soviets arrived, to make Pingfang into the empty ground its maps had always pretended it was.
But the erasure was incomplete. And it was incomplete in a way that mattered enormously to what came next. The buildings could be demolished and the local evidence destroyed, but the most valuable thing the program had produced was not the buildings. It was the knowledge, the accumulated research findings carried in the minds of the scientists and in part in records that were not burned but evacuated. Ishii and the senior staff did not flee empty-handed. They carried out of Manchuria the one asset that could not be reconstructed by anyone else, the data. They understood that the physical complex was expendable and that the research was not. And they understood something else, something that would shape every decision they made in the months ahead. The war against the Allies was lost, but the world that was coming after the war was already dividing into two camps. And a program that knew how to weaponize disease might be worth something to one of those camps, if the men who held the knowledge could reach the right buyer before the wrong one reached them.
By the time Japan formally surrendered in early September of 1945, the senior personnel of Unit 731 had largely made it back to the home islands and dispersed into the wreckage of a defeated country. Ishii himself returned to Japan and for a time attempted to vanish. There were even reports, circulated and later discounted, that he had died. The strategy in those first weeks was concealment, to become invisible inside the chaos of the occupation, to let the program sink beneath the surface of a nation preoccupied with its own collapse. But concealment was only ever going to be a holding action. The Americans who now governed Japan were beginning to ask questions about the Army's wartime research, and the Soviets, who had overrun Manchuria and captured some of the lower-ranking personnel who had not escaped, were asking questions of their own. Ishii and the men around him faced a choice that would define the rest of their lives. They could stay hidden and hope, or they could come out on their own terms
and offer the one thing that might be valuable enough to buy them protection.
The Americans came at the question of Japanese biological warfare primarily not as prosecutors, but as investigators with a scientific interest that gradually overwhelmed their legal one. In the months after the surrender, a series of officers and scientists were sent from the United States to find out what Japan had done in this field. The first arrived with a mandate to gather intelligence. Among the investigators whose names appear in the record were a microbiologist named Murray Sanders, who conducted early interviews, an officer named Arvo Thompson, and later, men sent from the American Biological Warfare Research Center at Camp Detrick in Maryland, the very institution whose work overlapped most directly with what the Japanese program had pursued. Investigators including Norbert Fell, and later still Edwin Hill, were tasked with assessing not whether the Japanese scientists had committed crimes, which was increasingly clear, but what their research was worth. The mandate, quietly, was shifting, from finding out what had been done to finding out what could be acquired.
The negotiation that followed was never a single dramatic meeting, but a slow convergence of interests conducted through interviews and reports over many months. The Japanese scientists understood their position with precision. They had something the Americans wanted, a body of research derived from methods no American institution could replicate on the effects and military application of biological agents. The Americans understood their position too. They were in the early years of a deepening rivalry with the Soviet Union, and the prospect that the same data might fall into Soviet hands through the personnel the Soviets had captured lent the entire matter a strategic urgency that pushed the question of justice steadily into the background. The shape of the bargain emerged from this mutual understanding. The scientists would hand over their accumulated knowledge, the reports, the findings, the analysis, to the United States. And in return, the United States would ensure that they were not prosecuted for war crimes. Knowledge for immunity. That was the trade.
What makes the bargain so significant is the contrast it draws with the way the rest of the post-war reckoning was conducted. In Europe, at Nuremberg, the Allies had established the principle that there were crimes so grave that following orders was no defense, and that the men who committed them would answer with their lives. Medical experimentation conducted without consent was, at Nuremberg, treated as precisely such a crime, and physicians were tried and condemned for it. The Tokyo Tribunal, running in parallel, was trying Japan's wartime leadership on similar foundations. By any consistent application of the principles the Allies had just established, the leadership of Unit 731 belonged in a courtroom alongside the men already standing in one. Instead, they were quietly steered around it. The data was judged to be worth more than the precedent. And so, the same nation that helped write the law at Nuremberg made an exception to it in occupied Japan, an exception it intended never to acknowledge.
The immunity was not granted in a single signed document that the world could later point to. It was assembled out of decisions made at multiple levels of the occupation administration, justified internally on the grounds that the intelligence value to the United States exceeded the value of a prosecution, and protected by the simple expedient of leaving the entire matter out of the public record. The general headquarters of the occupation, operating under the authority of MacArthur as supreme commander, was aware of the arrangement and permitted it to proceed. Recommendations passed upward through the American government that the scientific information be obtained and that war crimes prosecution of those who provided it be avoided, on the reasoning that public exposure of the program would compromise the intelligence and hand a propaganda advantage to the Soviets. The bargain, in other words, was not a rogue act by a single officer. It was a considered decision made by an institution to trade justice for information, and to keep that trade invisible.
The Soviets did not make the same bargain, and the reason is as much about geopolitics as about principle. In overrunning Manchuria,
Soviet forces had captured a number of Unit 731 personnel who had not escaped south in time. The Soviets interrogated them, assembled evidence, and reached a different calculation than the Americans had. In December of 1949, in the far eastern city of Khabarovsk, the Soviet Union put 12 of these captured personnel on trial for preparing and using biological weapons. The Khabarovsk trial was, in the narrow sense, the only formal judicial proceeding that ever addressed the crimes of the Japanese biological warfare program. The defendants were convicted and sentenced to terms in labor camps. It was, on its face, the justice that the Tokyo process had declined to deliver. But it arrived attached to a complication that allowed the United States to dismiss it almost entirely.
The complication was that the Khabarovsk trial was a Soviet proceeding, conducted at the height of the early Cold War, by a state that ran its own courts as instruments of policy, and that had its own reasons for wanting the program's existence made public. Because the trial served Soviet propaganda interests, exposing an American cover-up by implication, and presenting the Soviet Union as the only power willing to prosecute, the United States was able to wave it away as communist theater, the accusations as fabrication, the entire proceeding as a show. This was the quiet genius of the position the Americans had placed themselves in. By holding the only complete set of the data, and by keeping their own bargain secret, they had ensured that the one party willing to tell the truth about Unit 731 was also the one party the Western public was least inclined to believe. The truth was available. It was simply delivered by a messenger that had been pre-discredited. And so, the silence held, not because no one spoke, but because the only voice that spoke could be ignored.
What followed in Japan was the quietest part of the entire story. The senior scientists of Unit 731, having handed over their knowledge and received their protection, returned to ordinary life. Some resumed careers in medicine and pharmaceuticals. Some moved into positions in public health and the institutions of the new, peaceful Japan. The man who had run the program lived out his remaining years in his own country, never prosecuted, never compelled to answer in any courtroom for what the unit had done. Kitano Masaji, who had commanded the unit during a period of Ishii's absence, likewise carried on. The men did not vanish into hiding or exile. They were simply absorbed back into a society that had agreed with its occupiers not to look too closely. The records they had traded went into American archives and were stamped with the classifications that would keep them sealed for decades. And the subject itself became something that was not discussed, not by the government that had committed the acts, and not by the government that had bought them.
The silence lasted roughly a generation. It was not until the latter decades of the 20th century, through the patient work of journalists, scholars, and eventually the gradual declassification of the wartime and occupation records, that the outline of the bargain became publicly documented rather than merely alleged. The American files that survived began to be released. Researchers reconstructed the negotiation from the paper trail the bargain's architects had been careful to keep thin. What had been dismissible as Soviet propaganda in 1949 became, by the 1980s, a matter of established historical record, confirmed from the very government that had concealed it. The exposure changed nothing for the men involved, most of whom were by then beyond the reach of any court. But it changed the historical accounting. The bargain could no longer be denied. It could only be explained. And the explanation, when it came, was uncomfortable for everyone, because it was not the story of a single villain. It was the story of an institution that had decided, deliberately, that some knowledge was worth more than justice.
The question that hangs over the entire bargain is whether the data was even worth what was paid for it. Here, the historical record offers a bitter conclusion. Much of the research the United States acquired turned out to be of limited practical value, incomplete, methodologically compromised,
and in significant part, already within the reach of legitimate scientific work being done elsewhere. The exception that had been made, the precedent that had been quietly broken, the prosecutions that had been foregone, were exchanged for an archive that did not deliver the strategic advantage its purchasers had imagined. This is the part of the story that is hardest to sit with. It would be one thing, still wrong, but at least comprehensible, if the bargain had bought some decisive military capability. Instead, a nation traded away a principle it had just helped to establish at Nuremberg, in return for a body of knowledge that, in the cold assessment of hindsight, it largely did not need. The price was certain. The value was not.
There is a precedent embedded in the Unit 731 bargain that reached far beyond the specific case, and it is the part that historians return to most often. The Tokyo and Nuremberg tribunals were meant to establish a permanent principle that there are acts so far outside the bounds of legitimate conduct that no state interest, no claim of military necessity, no value of the resulting knowledge can excuse them. The immunity granted to the leadership of the biological warfare program established a quiet counter-principle, never stated aloud, but unmistakable in the act, that the rule had an exception, and that the exception was triggered by usefulness. If what you had done produced something a victorious power wanted badly enough, the door of the courtroom could be made to open and let you walk back out. That counter-principle, once enacted, did not stay confined to one program in one occupied country. It became part of the texture of how great powers actually behaved toward useful men with terrible records, a pattern repeated in other forms, in other places, throughout the century that followed. What the silence cost is harder to measure than what the data was worth, but it is the more important figure. For the survivors of what the program had done, and for the country in which it had operated, the bargain meant that the crime was never formally judged, never entered into the official ledger of the war's accounting in the way that other crimes were. The absence of a trial is not a neutral fact. A trial is, among other things, a society's mechanism for naming what happened, for fixing it in the record, for telling the people who suffered that their suffering was seen and weighed. The bargain denied all of that, not out of any wish to protect the perpetrators for their own sake, but as the incidental cost of protecting the data. The men who were not tried were not spared because anyone thought them innocent. They were spared because they were useful. And a society that learns its worst acts can be erased from the record by being useful enough has learned a lesson that does not stay learned in only one generation. This was the last secret Japan surrendered after the war was over. Not on a battlefield where the fighting had already stopped, but in a filing room where the most consequential transaction of the occupation was conducted in a silence both sides agreed to keep. The fleets had been sunk, the cities burned, the surrender signed on the deck of a battleship in Tokyo Bay. And then, quietly, an archive changed hands, and a principle was set aside, and the men who held the most dangerous knowledge of the war walked free into the peace. But the surrender of Japan's secrets did not end with the files of Pingfang. Far out in the Pacific, sealed inside the largest submarines ever built, aircraft carriers designed to launch a strike the Americans never saw coming, sat another secret the United States was determined no one else would ever possess. And when the war ended, America did not study those submarines and share them. It took them out to sea, and it sank them on purpose, where no rival could ever reach them. Next on Tor Files, the underwater aircraft carriers, and the deliberate burial that kept them secret for half a century. Tor Files tells the untold history of the Pacific War from the Japanese side, one episode at a time. Subscribe to see the next chapter.